Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last lecture on Gandhara this semester. My name is Sanjyot Mehendale, and I'm the chair of the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies. As mentioned earlier, the series on Gandhara was organized in conjunction with a new exhibit at the Berkeley Art Museum. It's titled Beyond Boundaries, Buddhist Art of Gandhara. And it's organized by Julia White, senior curator at the BAMFA, and Professor Emeritus Osmund Bopearachchi. You can find information regarding this exhibition scheduled to run from April 30th to October 3rd this year on the Berkeley Art Museum website. Now, please note, though, that the galleries will be open only on a limited basis, and initially they're going to be open just for members and the UC Berkeley community. So please double check the information before you schedule a visit. Turning to logistics, I'm sure at this point you're all familiar with the format. The speaker and the panelists won't be able to hear or see the audience. So if you have questions regarding the talk, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I'm going to try to entertain as many of them as possible. Now, for technical issues, please use the chat box, which will be monitored by our webinar host, Skye van Valkenburg. Now, back to today's talk. I've asked Osmund Bopearachchi to do the honors of introducing our speaker, as he is most familiar with her career and research specialization. Now, Dr. Bopearachchi, known to many of you, has been informally affiliated with UC Berkeley for the last 20 years or so, I believe, if not more. And formally, for the past 5 years, he was adjunct professor of Central Asian and South Asian art, archaeology, and numismatics. Now, I could easily spend a whole hour rattling off his academic achievements, such as his 12 monograms, including in 2020, when West met East, Gandharan Art Revisited, which received the Hirayama Award from the French Academy of Inscriptions and Belles-Lettres. In addition, I could list 6 edited books, I could list 162 research articles, or the 91 papers delivered at international colloquia, his 275 conference presentations in 80 cities, and his 120 archaeological missions in 24 different countries. Instead, what I would like to emphasize here today is his undying support of the next generations of art historians, archaeologists, and Buddhist studies scholars across Europe, India, Sri Lanka, and the US, among others. His erudition, his encouragement, his generosity, and guidance of undergraduates and graduate students provided many, myself included, the tools to navigate the challenges of careers in academia and in the field over the last 40 years. And I think it is, in this regard, really only fitting that he be the one to introduce our speaker today, Jessie Pons. So welcome, Osmund. Thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you, Sanjyot, for the introduction. It's always nice to hear good things. I am extremely pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jessie Pons, who is Junior Professor for South Asian History of Religions at the Center for Religious Studies in Ruhr University in Bochum in Germany. Professor Pons studied at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London and obtained a Bachelor of Arts in Art History and Archaeology in 2002. Upon returning to France, she graduated from the Louvre Art School, known as École du Louvre, and followed a course in Western Art and Museum Studies. She enrolled in a master's degree at the University of Paris 1 Sorbonne under the supervision of Henri Paul Frankfurt. Having defended this thesis, she enrolled in a DOA MPhil under my supervision at the Paris 4 Sorbonne. Thus, I had the pleasure of working with her and following her research for many years. For her MPhil thesis, she compiled a corpus of the Gandharan toilet trays and examine the iconography of these enigmatic and complex objects. It was a remarkable work which was rewarded with the first-class honors. This enabled her to obtain a scholarship to complete her Ph.D. She enrolled in a thesis on the subject, inventory and systematic study of the sites and Buddhist sculptures of Gandhara, workshops and production centers. An exhaustive corpus was presented as a database consisted of more than 900 sculptures from 150 archaeological sites in Gandhara. She made a systematic review of excavation reports, exhibition catalogs, and scholarly articles to develop this database. It was therefore necessary to undertake a study by visiting museums where most of these sculptures are kept. She was able to examine the collections of Indian Museum in Varanasi, Calcutta, New Delhi, Chandigarh, and Bombay. She has seen 4 major collections in the United States. She also had the opportunity to examine in detail all the major Japanese and European collections. Her computerized database is a real source of information for all those who work in the field of Gandharan art, because such a work had never really been done before in such a complete and systematic way. In this database, she gives all necessary information, namely the identification of objects, its dimensions, its provenance, the conditions of discovery, a bibliography, as well as photographs often taken by her. We can never stress enough how difficult it is to carry out such a work, which requires so much skill, patience, and perseverance. In her research on Gandhara, she draws upon the results of a doctoral dissertation on the identification and characterization of sculptural styles to reassess certain problems connected to Buddhism in the region, such as networks of communities, the emergence of Mahayana Buddhism, instances of cultural and religious interactions, and the diffusion of biography of the Buddha. Her today's talk is partly based on the results she obtained in identifying workshops and production centers. Between 2010 and 16, she worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Religious Studies in Ruhr University in Bochum. She was awarded a junior professor position in 2016. Trained as an art historian and embedded in a religious studies department, she is particularly attentive to the relationship between religion and art, to the role of material objects in religious experiences and the study thereof. In her research, the historical region of Gandhara remains her favorite field for reflection, but she has developed a keen interest in discourses around the preservation of religious material, heritage, and appropriation, destruction, or reconstruction of religious sites and art objects for shifting ideological purposes. Since 2016, she has been involved in several projects for the digital documentation and preservation of Buddhist artifacts. In 2019, together with her colleague, Dr. Frederick Elwet, she has established a Pelagios working group, linked data methodologies in Gandharan Buddhist art and texts. The working group brings together a team of art historians and archaeologists, philologists and historians of Buddhism, as well as experts in digital humanities for international institutions to explore potential uses of linked open data principles in bridging different digital collections of Gandharan Buddhist textual and visual sources. In January 2021, this year, she and her colleague, Frederick Elbert, received a grant from the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research to conduct their project, Digitization of Gandharan Artifacts, a project for the preservation and study of Buddhist art of Pakistan. The project was officially launched in February and will run for a period of 3 years. During this time, and thanks to the precious support of the Directorate of Archaeology and Museums in Pakistan, the Italian Archaeological Mission in Pakistan, and the Heidelberg University Library, a team of researchers will travel to Pakistan to digitize and catalog a corpus of nearly 2,000 Buddhist sculptures. These were excavated in 13 ancient Buddhist monasteries located in the northern confines of Gandhara, around the modern cities of Gandhara and Sarji Sharif, and were currently kept in the Deer Museum in Gandhara and the Mission House of the Italian Archaeological Mission in Pakistan. The digitization of Gandharan artifacts will produce a database of documented objects available on open access. Jessie has published several papers on Gandharan art. I just mentioned one or two. Linked data methodologies in Gandharan Buddhist art and text, Pelagios working group final reports, and methodologies of primary results of a stylistic analysis, archaeology in Gandhara, review of research at the crossroads of disciplines, the figure with a bow in Gandharan great departure scene, from Gandharan trace to Gandharan Buddhist art, the persistence of Hellenistic motifs from 2nd century BC and beyond. She is in the process of reworking her doctoral dissertation into a monograph that will be published with preambles under the title L'art du Gandhara, recherche sur les sculptures bouddhiques, premier siècle au 4e siècle. This series will come, and book will come under the series Indigo Tolstoy. All those interested in Gandharan art are looking forward to this major publication. Today, Jessie will talk to us on where was wine drunk in Gandhara. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jessie Pons. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Osmund, for your kind invitation. And I must say, and I speak, I think, also for Ariane and Olivier and your other doctoral student, it's been a real treat to be your doctoral, to conduct a PhD under your supervision. And I'm very grateful to you and Sanjyot for your kind invitation to talk to you tonight or this afternoon, and to Frank Ville for facilitating my transfer to Berkeley. Thank you also, Sky. It's a pleasure, a real pleasure and honor to be here. And I sincerely hope that it will not be too long before we can all meet in analog form. I wish a good morning, good afternoon, and a good evening to the members of the audience. So, as Osmund indicated, this presentation situates itself within a series of studies which build upon my doctoral research on the identification and characterization of Gandharan sculptural styles, and try to contribute to broader questions about Gandharan arts and Buddhism. So in other words, I explore how patterns in the geographic distribution of iconographic and formal motifs, which constitute Gandharan art, may inform us on problems connected to the history of Buddhism in the region. And by focusing on reveling scenes today, this presentation is a foray into the topic of visual manifestations of phenomena of cultural and religious interactions. So these scenes depict figures playing music, dancing, engaged in the preparation and the consumption of wine, and abandoning themselves to its disinhibiting effects. The protagonists indulge in a panoply of sensual pleasures, which appear at first blush difficult to reconcile with our understanding of or traditional idea of Buddhist monasticism. These imageries have aroused great interest in scholarship, and studies on what has been traditionally called Dionysian scenes have been concerned with tracing their iconographic prototypes, unwinding their signification, and ultimately unraveling their why they would be rallied to the Buddhist cause. This paper is therefore another contribution to a topic on which a great deal of ink has already been expended. I nevertheless hope that the approach that I adopt, somewhat alternative maybe, can shed, if not entirely new, at least complementary light onto the topic. And in this less than encouraging climate, with the Theravada New Year approaching and Vesak approaching, a review of these uplifting scenes will not be too inappropriate. So as a preamble, I will outline the result of my stylistic analysis. I will present the methodological approach underlying this study, and by extension, the reassessment of the function of images of reveling Gandharan art. I will then delineate the typological variety of the images and try and map out their patterns of distribution across Gandhara. And I will finally discuss how the evidence that the stylistic study brings to the fore alternatively complements, corroborates, and sometimes contradicts the hypotheses that have been put forward to account for their presence on the Buddhist stupa. And these broadly fall into three interpretative schemes that are briefly listed here, but will be examined into more detail in the later part of my presentation. So the soteriological interpretation, the sociocultural interaction interpretation, and the cosmological interpretation. So ultimately, what I'll be arguing in this paper is that while each of these interpretations finds a justification to some extent, none can be satisfactorily applied to the entire Gandharan production. And the arguments which will run as a subtext are that the iconography of scenes of reveling they were malleable enough to accommodate sometimes simultaneously several meanings, and that these images found, possibly at a local level, distinct resonances for the culturally diverse audience of Gandhara. Now, let me finally indicate that, as a side note, that scholarship has traditionally referred to these images as Bacchanalian or Dionysian scenes on the assumption that these are imports from the Mediterranean West. This is certainly true to some degree, as these images are clearly derived from Roman and Greek prototypes, and the scenes which they illustrate cover the key ritualistic features of Dionysian tradition. I will nevertheless prefer to use the less culturally connoted and more generic term reveling scenes in hope to overcome the East-West dichotomy within which our approach of these scenes and of Gandharan art in general sometimes remains constrained. So turning to the first section, the stone sculptures produced in the region of Gandhara or Greater Gandhara during the first 4 centuries of the Common Era share features which justify the designation of a Gandharan art, the prominent use of schist, the ubiquitous depiction of Buddhist subjects, as well as the aesthetic language which results from the Indian, Iranian, Greco-Roman heritage of the region. And despite this indubitable homogeneity, local iconographic and formal differences can be identified. And several studies have been dedicated to the characterization of some of these local productions. And these are mentioned here. I will not go into them in any further detail. Within the framework of my doctoral research, I have attempted to complement the map of the different stylistic expressions. I was concerned with the assessment of the various sculptural languages and their level of relationship. The comparative analysis of the sculptures, as Osmund indicated, relied on a corpus of documented pieces compiled in accordance with an inventory checking. And this includes a systematic biographical and archival research, as well as the visit of permanent and storage collections. The stylistic study does not claim to be exhausted. It must be indicated at the outset, for instance, that It does not systematically cover the production in stucco or clay, although it might refer to it for comparative purposes. Nor does it include the rock carvings documented by the Italian archaeological mission in the Swat Valley. And I should also add that issues of dating have remained relatively peripheral. And here I unequivocally adhere to Domenico Sfaccina's view that mapping the sculptural languages and the identification of their synchronic ties are a prerequisite to the reconstruction of their diachronic ties. Its limitations aside, this research remains extensive enough to bring recurring patterns to the fore and see tendencies emerge in the geographic distribution of iconographic and formal motifs. So the methodology deployed for the comparative study itself primarily draws upon the work of Domenico Sfaccina, but also Francine Tissot, Lolita Nero, Lydia De Hegia, and Martina Steuer, Francine Tissot, as I indicated. And it encompasses several layers of analysis of the sculptures, their iconographic motifs, for instance, the representation of the Buddha, Bodhisattvas, tutelary deities, donors, their informal features, the rendering of the proportions, their measurement, their volumes, and in the case of narrative reliefs, their composition. And in this respect, I concentrated on 8 most frequently represented biographical episodes in the life of Siddhartha Gautama: the Dipankara Jataka, Maya's dream, the birth of Siddhartha Gautama, the great departure, Mara's assault, the request of Brahma and Indra, the first sermon, the Mahaparinirvana. And in other words, I endeavored to reconstruct the iconographic and formal repertoires, as well as the techniques of storytelling that were used at each site. And my identification of the stylistic variations is therefore largely based on typological studies, such as this example here of the Great Departure, and the different types are kind of listed for the deity who escorts Siddhartha on his way out of the palace, and Kantaka emerging out of the door. And this process was carried out co-jointly with the development of a fitting vocabulary critical for the objective characterization of the pieces and their typological classification and the pertinence of their comparison. And as indicated by Osmund, this reflection on the standardization of vocabularies for the description of Gandharan Buddhist art has been relevant beyond the scope of my doctoral research. And Osmund mentioned the Pelagios working group that my colleague Frederic Elvert and I established, and which seeks to develop, establish ontologies that would foster the cross-linking between collections of not only images, but also of text, and which facilitates their simultaneous analysis. Now, subsequent to the definition of the various artistic productions, I sought to reconstruct the various synchronic links between these. The aim here was to determine the relatedness of the diverse styles circumscribed, which in turn would bespeak the existence of regional schools, artistic zones, production centers, and workshops. And it must be said here that these terms do not correspond to concrete material entities, but are loose concepts that are used to designate and chart the levels of relationship and capture the dynamic of the production at the different levels of relationship and the dynamic of the production at both at the local level of a site and at the regional level, so across several sites. A full account of these languages is outside of the scope of this representation, but a brief outline might help to place the scenes of revelry within the broader context of their geographical production. So it's possible to circumscribe two major regional schools, which you might see here, the Swat, those of the Swat Valley and of the Peshawar Basin. And across both schools, one can recognize three artistic zones located in the Jambil, here, in the Jambil Saidu zone, the Kalpani Valley, as well as the Middle Gadar Valley. And several important production centers which are situated within these artistic zones, such as Putkara, so here, Saidu Sharif, and Sari Balol, and Taktibai, Jamalgari, Tarili, and Sekri. And two minor schools, the northern passes and the region of Kapisar. Finally, a series of workshops with their unique languages, which can be located in each of these regions, as well as in Zardari on the eastern confines here, and others in the Taro Hamra zones around Taxila and in the lower Swat Valley. Now, this map might not come as a surprise for the scholars who are acquainted with Gandharan styles. But of great interest, hopefully, today is to observe the work performed by the scenes of revelry in the repertoire of these various schools. So let us turn to the typological diversity and the distribution of these scenes. Now, altogether, these scenes cover a diversity of a rich repertoire of motifs, which may be broadly classified into three main categories. And they're respectively connected to performance, amorous play, and drinking. Now, we observe human figures playing and dancing music. This can be adults here, as well as young figures, young boys, or they can be mythological figures such as Nagas here and Angripids here, Nagas here as well. One sees representations of those various steps in the production of alcohol, stomping on grapes, on a pressing basin, being filtered here, as well as people who are consuming, the wine or the drinks, which is being transported in a goat skin or poured out in different types of cups and jars. The wine is being consumed with moderation or with less restraint. Here, this person has already is dizzy and being supported. It is often a man who is then supported by two female figures, or this person here is already lying, reclining lazily on his back and being poured more drink into by a female attendant. Other types of figures are partaking in these activities. Here, these two figures depicted in bust rather than in full length, and animals. We find lions, boars, as well as here birds. And here a variation of the theme with this young boy sitting on a sort of a dragon. Connects to we find another type of scene of a more ceremonial nature here with this man sitting dressed in Kushan fashion, sitting on a correlate type chair, and this type often occurs in connection to sacrificial scenes where an animal, generally a goat, is brought to the dignitary. Then we move on to scenes of amorous play, which vary in their degree of subjectivity, with this here couple flirting, here exchanging a kiss, disrobing each other, and here engaging in more more erotic activities. One may find variations of the theme where the different motifs are embedded into a scroll, or often, and this is more often the case than not, these motifs are all combined within a single relief. This needs not always be the case, but it is generally the tendency. And when we look at these various motifs in relation to the scenes which adjoin them, the supports on which they are carved and their geographic distribution across Gandhara, we might see the following. Firstly, all these types are represented in the production of the Swat Valley, and here only. And the regional concentration of these depictions was already noted by Anna Filigenzi on account of the material excavated the sites in the Jambil Saidu zone. So this is Butkara 1, Saidu Sharif, Pandr, and to this we might include Shainesha. And one may, however, extend this observation to the sites situated on the left bank of the Swat River in the tributary valleys of Talash, Shagkot, Ugad, Sherat, and Kandak. And these are, to some extent, some of the sites that we will be covering when we conduct the digitization of the material kept in Chagdara. Across these regions, we find figures dancing, playing music, drinking, engaging in frolics, occupying the architectonic elements of the complex false niches which were attached to the dome of the stupa, embracing couples and animals drinking in cornices or on these harmika slab. These reliefs with two superposed registers would be attached on one of the drums or the drum of the stupa, and one would also find other types of reliefs, niches, embracing couple under a niche or an arch, and pedestals with this here, this putti who are holding a cup, which are framing the pedestal, and this dividing element presenting a pot-bellied figure pouring a drink from a goat skin. Now, this is not to say that every single type is to be encountered at each of the above-mentioned sites. Rather, what this evidence shows is that the production of these artistic zones, the Shagkot, Talash, and the Jambil Saidu zones here, reflect a common language, that of the Swat school, and that reveling scenes play a comparable role in the visual repertoire of the sites. And outside of the Swat Valley, the production from Zarderi in the Siran Valley is the only one which parallels this diversity, or it's where the implementation of reveling scenes follows similar schemes. So let me mention, for the sake of illustration, this jump of a false niche inhabited by figures amusing themselves to the sound of the music played by those around them, and those carried away by the intoxicating effects of alcohol. And this other relief here, to which I will return, which portrays a row of pseudo-Ilompin gods banqueting. Now, with that said, the case of Zarderi aside, the typological diversity which characterizes the production of the Swat Valley is not matched anywhere else in Gandhara. Out of the sites, the array of types encountered is not too similar, but the supports on which these are carved is more limited, and alternative choices are made. As a general tendency, the sequence of protagonist carousing is arranged in an uninterrupted frieze on a single regular panel. And while some of these panels might have been attached on the platform, the dome of the stupa, some are clearly identifiable as terrorizers, such as this one from Jamalgari. At the sites of Jamalgari, Shakilgundi, and Azisteri, these terrorizers were found in situ. At Jamalgari, the reliefs were fixed on the stairs which connected the south side of the main stupa complex and the lower Vihara courts. At Shakiligundi and Azizderri, so at Shakiligundi on the staircase leading to the main stupa platform, and at Azizderri on the staircase of the main stupa. Now, this gives a reasonable indication of the sequence within which the panels carved with image of merrymaking appear. So one finds garland bearers, nagas playing music, figures on acanthus leaves or in balcony, as well as illustrations of previous lives of the Buddha. So here one sees, for instance, the Shibi Jataka. Here you have an example from Azizderri with the garland bearers. Now, I should perhaps make clear that stair rises and frieze panels are not the only support on which reveling scenes appear. And this panel with two superposed registers here discovered at Sikri, and these fragments of the lateral naves of two false niches respectively discovered at Bad Gai and Jamalgari provide enough incentive to nuance this statement. But different iconographic choices are made. As in Swat, an example of which you have here, the lower registers are filled with episodes from the Buddha's hagiography. But on the upper register, in place of adults indulging unrestingly in the pleasures of the senses, or here these more ceremonial scenes, we find we are met with images of youthful figures dancing and stomping on grapes. Now, erotic scenes seldom appear and are overall of a more suggestive character. They're more suggestive than explicit. So taken together, the representations from the Peshawar Valley, the Haro Tamra zone, so that's Taxila, and the Lagman Valley, that's around Jalalabad, pale in comparison with the more exuberant and eclectic repertoire from Swat. Now let us turn to the different interpretative schemes for the presence of these scenes in Gandharan Buddhist art. In the time which remains, I would like to put this evidence in dialogue in relation with the various hypotheses proposed to account for the presence of these scenes on the Buddhist stupa. My aim here is not to map each of these types with an interpretative model, but to highlight how some may lend support and possibly add to one or the other hypothesis. Now, before I do so, and although this is a story known to all already, I should perhaps recall in the context of this discussion that the presence and popularity of the motifs are not the issue. And to outline the key features of this story, allow me to draw here on Martha Carter's account of the triumph of Dionysius in Asia, although it will be difficult to do justice to her very comprehensive and astute outline. So textual, archaeological, and ethnological evidence has established that the region of Gandhara, particularly its northern confines, Swat, had a long-standing cultural tradition associated to winemaking prior to the arrival of the Greek. And this pre-existing cultural ferment undoubtedly enabled religious and cultural practices related to Dionysus to take root and spread in the region. One might also evoke in this regard the corollary diffusion of drama, of which Dionysus is the mythological patron, which was discussed by Pia Brancaccio last March. Now, whether this Dionysian tradition continued in its own right, or whether it was absorbed into local cults is difficult to say, though one may assume that both were true. Practices related to winemaking and wine consumption shared enough features for cultures to meet and boundaries to dissolve. The imagery certainly bear testimony to processes of adoption and adaptation and Hellenistic Greece, was not the only agent of cross-fertilization. And by the time Buddhist sculptures were produced in the first centuries of the Common Era, the tradition of winemaking, or at least its material reflections, were shaped by cultural influx that not only from Greece and Rome, but also from Hellenistic Central Asia. And scholarship has largely dissected the ways in which the iconography of Gandharan reveling scenes compares or contrasts to their Western prototypes or pendants in the neighboring regions of Bactria, Sogdia, Khwarezmia, and India. This assessment of the models has often construed the appreciation of the scenes in relation to their Buddhist context. The assumption that a borrowed symbol carries with it its original significance is one which is not always true. And naturally, the complexity thickens when one considers that the figure of Dionysus and his cognate imagery interweave several dimensions and associate him to ideas of fertility, salvation, madness, theater. As the review of the types suggests, the motifs reflect a wide variety of semantic range. And while some motifs may still encompass their original meaning or an alleged original meaning, the latter may also be conditioned by the placement of the images in the Buddhist context, in the Buddhist complex, the type of support on which they are carved, and the scenes which adjoin them. And while Fouché, Tucci, and Tadei have examined these imageries in their pioneering work, one may take the article published in 1985 by Klaus Fischer as venture point for exploration of the various interpretative schemes, not least because I will return to it later. Examining scenes of amorous play, the author acknowledges their different connotations. On the one hand, the enamored couples, reminiscent of those found on Greek and Roman gems, or of the mitunas of Mathura and Andhra, may conjure ideas of auspiciousness and fertility. Overall, their occurrence in the context of the stupa might not be too dissonant with the yakshis of Sanchi, which you see here, or the couples in lascivious poses on the gateway, on the reliefs of Amaravati, which you see on the left. Others, on the other hand, and we've seen examples of that, are of a more explicit content and project different ideas. These may be read as, and I quote, a warning against sexual pleasures and an admonition to laymen and monks to avoid women and erotic passion as a danger, as well as a hindrance on the way to final liberation. End of quote. These function as a reminder, argues Fischer, of the tension between love and renunciation, a tension central to the moral lessons of the Riyashringa Jataka and Ashvagosha's play Soundarananda, which, as Fischer's contends, must have been known to the authors of the reliefs and their audience. In reaction to Fischer's article, Katsumi Tada made notes that the scenes are rather attracting and that they would probably appeal to the monks rather than being condemned by them. Instead, Tanabe contends that these scenes illustrate the pleasures enjoyed from by those reborn in a Buddhist paradise. This eschatological interpretation of the images results from their comparison with the funerary art of Rome and of the Roman world and Western Asia, and from an emphasis on the salvific dimension of Dionysus, who himself had gone through death and rebirth. On Roman sarcophagi, images of the Greek god and his Tiasos function as an allusion to the bliss promised to the deceased in the afterlife. This eschatological reading would be reinforced by the ketoi, the marine creatures, which assume the function of a sickle pump, carved on triangular elements of the staircases and other panels. Tanabe first identified these paradisiacal imageries as forerunners of illustrations of Sukhavati, the pure land of the Buddha Amitabha of Mahayana Buddhism. He restated his theory anew in an article about to be published, and which he generously allowed me to mention here. drawing in part upon the new epigraphic documentation from Gandhara, which I believe was discussed by Richard Salomon earlier this month, Tanabe proposes to read these images as the visual counterparts of an expression frequently contained in the dedication carved on reliquaries, hita, sukha, well-being, and happiness. As the author argues, this meaning tallies nicely with the function of the stair rises. And I quote, in Gandhara, the staircase of a stupa had a special function, something like a ladder or a rainbow emerging between heaven and earth, especially when it was decorated with Dionysian imagery and Greco-Roman marine retinue, the chassos. End of quote. In other words, the staircases function as a metaphor for the transitional heavenly realm before the next birth. While I have some reservations about the possibility to equate the specific notion of hita sukha with images of reveling, the idea that the stair rises the staircase altogether function as a bridge between the worldly and otherworldly realms, and altogether operate on a more elusive register is enticing. In fact, the evidence might encourage us to go a step further. And we turn to the test staircases from Jackie Gondi, Aziz Deri, and Jamal Ghali. Although the staircases from Jackie Gondi and Aziz Deri are fragmentary, and the reconstruction of the sequences of steps from Jamal Ghali is tentative, one can discern the contours of the overall scheme of these staircases. And the scenes of reveling are found in juxtaposition with jatakas, as I alluded to earlier. We find in Jamal Ghali the Chama Jataka, the Chandakinara Jataka, and the Shyama Jataka, and possibly others which are not completely identified. And at Shakili Gondi, one finds the Shibi Jakarta, with here the gift of the eyes. And at Aziz Deri, here is an example of the Shyama Jataka. With their concentration on the selection of previous birth stories, the stairways would conjure the Bodhisattva's path to Buddhahood and weave in auspicious evocations of a blissful afterlife. Altogether, the stairways can be envisaged as a powerful allusion to the stream of previous birth. Yet, the same evidence may lend itself to an alternative reading, one which was proposed by Bopearachchi. The author argues that these are associated to ideas of auspiciousness and good beginnings appropriate to the threshold of a Buddhist stupa. She draws attention to the physical location of the scenes at a subsidiary place on the staircases leading to the stupa complex. This place is subsidiary, on the staircases leading to the stupa complex, or on the platform, on the stupa platform, but not on the stupa drum itself. And in this sense, and I quote, they did not relate to the world of the Buddha, but rather to that of the devotee, and work as a preamble to the former. The presence of jatakas, which alludes to the Bodhisattva's path to Buddhahood across repeated rebirth, does not contradict Bopearachchi's interpretation. The staircases would therefore mark the passage between the secular and the sacred, she says. And one may further claim that a staircase is something that one walks on, and by walking on it, you subordinate it. One will step on the mundane world with its attachments, lost in drinking before reaching the higher level of the stupa. Bopearachchi further considers the celebratory scenes as reminiscent of popular beliefs centered on wine-making festivities. Yet she mainly discusses them in connection to the spread of the Dionysian tradition and the diffusion of Greek drama. The mundane connotations of the imageries have been more extensively examined by Harry Falk and Anna Filigenzi. who both argue that the archaeological and philological evidence point to close ties between Buddhist communities and practices involving the production and consumption of wine, as well as its economy. And we can infer from certain sections of the Vinaya, the code of the monastic discipline, that monks occasionally consumed wine for medical purposes. And the Vinaya of the Mula Sarvastivada school contains an interesting and repeatedly quoted passage in this regard. The letter is found in the Bhasya Jyavastu, the section which exposes rules on the preparation of food and the consumption and medicine. In this passage, the Buddha explains to the community of monks how one should prepare and eat grapes sent by a yaksha while he and his retinue are staying in the palace of another yaksha. And the Buddha preaches a sermon, and the banquet concludes with an explanation on how to distill wine by the Buddha. But the data examined by Falk and Filigenzi shed light on another dimension and reveal how practices related to wine production and consumption constitute an interface between Buddhist communities and local lay communities. Falk puts the scenes in relation to wine implements discovered in the region, which bear inscriptions commemorating the gifts of these wine vessels to the monastery. This would point to the fact that, quoting Falk, neither non-Buddhist visitors nor the heads of the monasteries were passionately opposed to the production, distribution, and consumption of wine in connection with religious festivals. End of quote. He further draws attention to stone tanks, large wine presses and vats documented by Luca Maria Olivieri and Massimo Vidale near monasteries in the region of Swat. Falk's thesis is that Buddhist monasteries probably took over the organization of the age-old festival, and why not, at least one may hope, regulated the consumption of liquor. As for Anna Filigenzi, she links these winemaking festivities to the Dardic cultural substratum in the Swat region, on which she focuses. And this substratum has been sort of materialized in the recent archaeological discoveries made in the region. Her demonstration pivots on the evidence gathered by Olivieri, Vidali, and Falk already mentioned, as well as on the artistic documentation from the Jambil Valley, so Saidu Sharif, Panur, Budkarawan. Central to her discussion are the reliefs with two superimposed registers, which you see here, and additional examples. The depictions of ceremonial celebrations occupying the upper register allows us to, and I quote, catch a glimpse of the world outside of the Buddhist area. She notes the open-air setting of these festivities. You may see here vegetable elements, as well as the semantic distinction between the Buddhist narratives here and the lay scenes, that the superposition of the registers divided by a straight festoon operates. To the author, these images bear witness to a status quo, she says, between the Buddhist monastic communities and the festival and ritual celebrations associated to wine in which lay members of the local elite of Swat partook. Filigenzi's interpretation of the scenes in view of the local dynamics is consistent with the distribution patterns outlined earlier. The endemic character of the specific iconography, which we highlighted, reinforces the local ties which she identifies. And if her line of argument were to be followed, one would have to conclude that the neighboring valleys of Shakot and Talash zones belong to the same cultural belts with the Dardic substratum. And here you see examples from Kanjarkote and Marjanai representing the same, showing the same specific type of relief. And as I said, they're only found in this region. There is another significant feature to note about these reliefs. If one turns to the examination of the reveling scenes in relation to the episodes to which they are juxtaposed, it will be seen that all the narrative scenes occupying the registers below relate to the cycle of Siddhartha Gautama's nativity and his career as his youth and his career as a bodhisattva. And one may add to these only. And this is a pattern that occurs in the other production. And I have here an example of coming from Sickly, where you see the episode of the competition and these boys dancing under arches. Now let us turn to the final interpretative model. The cosmological interpretation, first advocated by Martha Carter, hinges on the principle that the stupa reflects the Indian view of the stratified world. These scenes should therefore be understood within this cosmological frame and represent one layer of the cosmos. Drawing upon the concepts of the Chakravala cosmology of Theravada Buddhism, Martha Carter establishes a connection between the Gandharan depictions and the intermediary worlds of the great kings of the four dimensions, the four directions, the Lokapalas. These are yakshas led by Kubera, and their intermediary worlds, the intermediary world of the Lokapalas themselves, is divided into three levels. One of these is that of the sadamatas, translated as always intoxicated, for which the reveling scenes would offer a suited illustration. Albeit with a less philological approach or inclination, this interpretative frame was adopted by Osmund Bopearachchi in his analysis of the stupa, said to be from Brunel, which he presented here and recently published in his monograph, When West Met East. Reconstructing the sequence of the stupa along the more generic terms of Indian cosmology, the author identifies the layer illustrating reveling scenes as the middle region occupied by Gandharvas and Yakshas, preceded above by that of the Devas and followed by that of the Manushyas, the earth creatures standing. The association of yakshas with wine and more generally drinking is corroborated by other documents. The king of yakshas, Kubera, was renowned for his love of alcohol, and one may here refer to the panel from Palikera, which is often mentioned as an illustration of the explicit connection between yakshas and intoxication. We can also refer to the passage from the Mula Sarvastivadi Vinaya previously evoked, which further strengthened this connection. The Buddha and his retinue were staying in the palace of the Yaksha Hastibala in Rohitaka, and the latter requested his Yaksha friend, Kutika, from Kashmir, to send some fruits from his northern country. And Kutika sends corpus of grapes, which, as the passage reports, the monks had never seen before. Although I find this identification of the layers illustrating reveling scenes as the middle region of the cosmos convincing, one remains puzzled by a certain feature in discrepancy in this succession of scenes. As you may note here, that the frieze of wine and merrymaking ends just above the encounter between the Bodhisattva and the Nagakalika. Above the illustration of the Enlightenment, it might be easier to look here, the Enlightenment, the Mahaparinirvana, and the cremation of the Buddha, we find this group of monks in a discussion holding what appears to be a scroll in their hands. If we are dealing with a representation of a higher level of the cosmos, a paradise, why do we observe a semantic demarcation comparable to that at play in the reliefs from Swat, as Filigenzi highlighted? This is, in fact, a pattern that reoccurs elsewhere. And we may turn to the fourth niche from Zarderi, which depicts an episode from the Buddha's life, which Osmund Bopearachchi identified as the descent of the Buddha from the Trayastrinta heaven and the meeting of the Buddha with the non-Utpalavarna. And on the lower, on the lower register where the scenes of revelry appear, these align with the possibly a sermon of the Buddha. On the upper register, which corresponds to the descent of the Buddha from heaven, we actually find a succession of devotees. So the reveling scenes stop here, they only appear on the lower register and stop on the upper register. And this is a pattern which is mirrored both on the left and on the right side. I must admit that at this stage, I am unable to account for the interruption we observe on the sequence of the stupa. And I very much look forward to Osmund's ideas. But what I think this evidence does do, however, is reveal a tension between the scenes of wine and merrymaking and their mundane associations on the one hand, and the supramundane implications of the Buddhist narrative program on the other. A tension which echoes resonates with Klaus Fischer's view with which we begin this exploration of the interpretative models. I am not suggesting that we should interpret the scenes of revelry as warnings against passions and hindrances on the way to liberation, or that they should be related to the Sandharananda. Rather, what I am saying is that placing the context of the scenes which juxtapose them and considering their position on the various supports, the images of winemaking and their assortment of sensual pleasures point as a whole, and regardless of which interpretative model we look at, to a tension between the worldly and the otherworldly spheres. Now, by way of conclusion, I would like to examine two sets of evidence. The first, which picks up on the thread of tension and will maybe help us fathom the sort of issues that the Buddhist communities grappled with concerning their involvement in festivities and in general, not necessarily related to winemaking, and the possible dichotomies with the world of the devotees that may ensue. The second will underline the polysemic character of the imageries, and that's it. The first set of evidence are passages in the Vinayas of the Mahasamgikas, the Dharmaguptakas, the Mahishasakas, and the Mulasarvativatas. These have been surveyed by Kuwayama in an article published in 2008. These passages are directly relevant to our discussion because they contain prescriptions, rather detailed ones, on how to build stupas, how to make offerings to them and maintain them. What is more, we know from epigraphic and literary evidence that, save for possibly the Mahishasakas, these schools were present in Gandhara. Certainly, one should exercise caution when putting these passages in direct relation to Gandharan material culture. These Vinayas were translated into Chinese around the 5th, 7th centuries of the Common Era, namely several centuries after the heyday of the production of the reliefs. With that said, the pictures which we can draw from them is one which must have not been too dissonant with that in Gandhara. Now, the prescriptions follow the prototypical structure for exposing the rule of monastic conduct, and interlocutor places a request or reports an issue to the Buddha on which he rules. In our specific examples, we have King Prasenajit, the donors of Shariputra and Madgalyana, monks and lay people, and the householder Ananda Bindada. They ask the Buddha whether he allows them to worship a stupa with dance, music, food, and drink. And here one must point to the fact that the Chinese character for drink, yin, is as generic as the English term drink implies. And here I thank very much my colleague Carmen Manat for clarifying this matter with me. So we're not specifically talking about alcohol here, we're talking about drinks in general. The Buddha grants permission to lay people and not to monks. Now, this in and of itself is not a big surprise. More interesting to note, however, are the the context of the stories. In the Dharma Gupsaka Vinayas, I won't read through the whole passage. We realize that these celebrations seem to have created some sort of confusion with respect to whom was authorized to engage in which type of activity. In the Mahishasaka Vinaya, it appears that the boundaries between members of the monastic community and the lay community were at times a little porous during these festivities, and that there was a need for the Buddhist monastic community to reinforce them. The ruling made by the Buddha in the Mahasamgika Vinaya is also interesting, as one may infer from it that these celebrations were frowned upon by certain members of the monastic community, or at least that it was a matter of debate, and it was necessary to authorize the practice by the Buddha itself, that such practices are in fact approved. It's also interesting to read in this passage of the Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya that it was necessary to specify that sexual intercourse should not be depicted on the stupa. And one may deduce from this literary evidence that some stupas actually did. And one cannot help but think about the monasteries of Swat in this regard. Now, maybe we can return to this evidence in the discussion. But I would like now to turn to this relief from Zarderi I alluded to earlier. It depicts a group of Olympian gods banqueting, or rather pseudo-Olympian gods, about to enjoy the dizzying effects of the drink that is served by a maenad here at the center and a pseudo-satyr. One may recognize on the left Aphrodite, then Apollo, Artemis, and possibly Dionysos here on the right, next to what remains of frolicking naked bodies. These portrayals are typical of classicizing imageries from Gandhara, which on the one hand show that Gandharan artists were acquainted with Western models, but which on the other hand cannot be considered any direct copy of any single object found in the West. Rather, they mix iconographic and formal motifs from various artistic traditions. And some example here you may be able to see on the slide. And by just opposing this group portrait of pseudo-Olympian gods with the scene of revelry, this relief adds complexity to an already difficult question. How are we to interpret their presence onto the stupa? If the interpretative model proposed by Cart and Bopearachchi was to be correct, and that Dionysian scenes, reveling scenes, are illustrating the world of always intoxicating yakshas, could the figures portrayed here belong to the retinue of Kubera under the guise of Greek gods? If one examines the relief within the framework of the model proposed by Brancaccio, Falk, and Felix Enzi, could the Greek figures reflect just another non-Buddhist cult here centered on the classical pantheon? My hypothesis is that the hypotheses that one may put forward in order to make sense of this relief are endless and never entirely satisfactory, and probably complementary. And as a matter of fact, and this will be my word of conclusion, the relief from Zarderi, as well as the reliefs that we skim through today, might reflect strategies of Gandharan Buddhist authorities to deal with the manifold cultural and religious contexts of Gandhara and accommodate a variety of religious cultural practices. These solutions or strategies might range from hijacking, a term used by Falk, popular practices related to winemaking and natural cults, absorbing classical gods into the Buddhist pantheon and cosmology, or playing on several entendres of the imagery to suit the need and creed of the viewer. There is little doubt that the visual landscape thus created would appeal to the various layers of the multicultural population living in Gandhara. And the ever-growing epigraphic corpus gradually provides us a portrait of this diversity. And in this respect, I would like to briefly mention a series of inscriptions from Zardari, and among them that found on the back of the relief portraying our pseudo-Olympian gods, Hari Shava. This is an Indian name, probably that of the artist. Another is that of the donor, Boreya of the Faras, which is obviously of Indian origin. Considering the entanglement of religious and cultural backgrounds mirrored in these inscriptions, one must suspect that the odd procession portrayed on the Zardari relief and this panoply of illustrations of sensual pleasures that we visited and revisited today may have been self-evident and self-explanatory in their time, but I'm afraid not entirely in ours. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jessie, for this very detailed, very wonderful talk. I've asked Osmund to start off the comments and questions, and then I will be monitoring the Q&A box for questions by the audience. Osmund, do you want to start us off?
Okay. Thank you, Sanjyot. I won't take much time to comment on that. Before that, I just want to thank you, Sanjyot, for organizing this series of talks in a very difficult period of humanity. And it's so nice to see you all, at least virtually. And also we had the pleasure of listening to Pia and then to Richard and today to Jessie. And my only hope is that in September, we will be able to organize the workshop on Gandharan art. We all meet together and discuss further. So coming back to Jessie's talk, as I told, at the beginning, you have more reliefs than I have. About the Dionysian saints. The secret is the work you have done. Your database is much richer than mine. You have, it's a very difficult task. I didn't insist upon that. Working on this database, you had to go through all the archaeological reports. Some may not know exactly the difficulty, because most of these sites in the past, especially in the 19th century, end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, were excavated by British officers, some of them without any archaeological knowledge. And as Sanjyot would agree with me, at that period, there was no stratified archaeology, and there was no real way of recording them, no inventories. And if there were any, they were very, in the summary, in a brief form. And also the third question is that most of these sculptures are dispersed. During the colonial period, those days India, and after that it became Pakistan and India, later Bangladesh. And these sculptures were distributed in some places, places like Madras, where there's no, any sort of a relationship with Gandhara. And also, I'm sure Jessie has seen the collection, the reserve collection in Calcutta. There are hundreds and hundreds of reliefs. Most of them are from Jamalgari. So it's a huge task to put all, settle this puzzle. It's everywhere. So the work you have done, and so it's wonderful in that sense. So you have more than 9,000, and certainly it's going to increase certainly in the future with the database that you are working on, and also with the collaboration of our Italian colleagues, Italian mission. So the numbers will increase. So first of all, my congratulations on this. And also, I don't want to comment on what you said. I agree completely with you, because it's very difficult to give an exact answer, because the first of all, we know very little about the places where these sculptures came from, especially the ones in the private collections. We don't know actually where they came from. Fortunately, the Bunesh Stupa is entirely saved, so we know the structural pattern of it. And what you said about the staircases, especially in South Delhi, is very important. Very few people looked at them, because it's not only Dionysian scenes, but also they are mixed with the Jataka stories. So we need to dig into this question further. I mean, apart from the cosmological interpretation that Martha and I defended, I think we should go into further into that. And also you didn't have time to talk, especially sometimes you get the Dionysian scenes on the pedestals, on the base of the Buddha statues. So many questions, and you presented them in such a nice way. So we have a complete idea of these scenes and also the different interpretations given by people, different scholars. I mean, you have on one side Falk and then Anna Filigensi, and then you have Pia and then Martha and others. So not that we are going to solve the problem today, but at least we ask the correct questions. I think the intelligence is to ask the correct question. I am sure there are a lot of questions regarding this. So I really congratulate on you on your presentation, and also thank you for pointing out to me the stratification of the Buddhist stupa. I didn't realize that the Dionysian scene stopped. I mean, I did the restitution, but I never looked at it in such a way. The Dionysian scene stopped at the point when just before the Enlightenment. And after the Enlightenment, you have the monks reading the scriptures. So thank you very much for these insights. I have to think about all these things. I'm sure Sanjyot and all those who are listening to this talk will have a lot of questions. So thank you, Jessie, for doing this. And I encourage you. My only question is, when are you going to publish this?
My PhD in general. It's been a recurring question for myself. So soon enough.
Before I go check the question and answer, the question box actually. I just had a quick question, maybe for the audience too. Do we know anything about the antiquity of winemaking in Gandhara? Sort of outside, Buddhism and these scenes, or a history of festivals. I mean, I'm thinking of the toilet trays, maybe. Is there a scholarship on that? And could you then argue a kind of appropriation and the seeking to control those types of festivals in a Buddhist context? That's right. What I was thinking of.
The history of winemaking and wine production has been a corollary to the research conducted by the Italian archaeological mission in Pakistan in the Swat Valley, and that's being published by Anna Filigensi and Luca Maria Olivieri in their respective research papers, and it's actually already quite a wonderful venture point into the question, and then looking at it from the glance of the Swat Valley, but already exploring into directions beyond. And that's with respect to the history of the festivities and so on. I don't think there is one that would be an interesting research to conduct. I don't think there's one at the moment, but it's my understanding that Dr. McHugh in University in California, I'm afraid I don't remember which specific institution he belongs to, is writing an history of wine or alcohol production, and that would have a chapter on the northwest, on Gandhara. So I think your answer might be your question might be answered sooner than later.
Okay, great. So the questions. Thank you so much for a great and informative talk. This is from Nikita Kuzmin. Could you please share your ideas about pictorial and relief depictions of the winged human figures, ? Angels in Gandharan art? Thank you.
I could try. I mean, I think we have several representations as well on the stair rises and more on framing elements, which is also the case here. And I'm not quite sure whether they probably have a deeper signification than just being a decorative element. I wouldn't be able to give a specific explanation for this. We have a researcher at our institute who has looked at the motif of these photo. I mean, again, here we have also a series of borrowing from the more Western repertoire, and she was looking at the diffusion of the motif from the West to Japan, actually, and looking at also diffusions from Central Asia to East Asia. So I'd be happy to put the member of the audience in contact with our colleague at the Institute who's been looking at that.
Has there been any studies on the objects, vessels used in these banquet or wine scenes?
But there's been typologies, and I think also it's part of the different archaeological excavations that are excavations that are conducted across Gandhara, and again in more urban contexts that these wine implements have also been examined. And I think the article by Sweat, which I have referred to, also looks at their usage and their different forms and the inscriptions that are engraved on them.
In your research, have you found some reference about sugarcane or sugar in all these material?
There might be, but I don't know them.
The next question is, are there images of Maitreya Bodhisattva in the images you showed?
There are none on these scenes of revelry, but there are plenty in Gandhara, that is for sure. But we have some representations on the pedestal, the pedestals, and we no longer have the statue that was, standing on this pedestal. So some might have been Maitreya, but, that's just open to conjecture. So, yes, there are representations of Maitreya in connection to Gandhara, to revelry scenes. I do not know. I haven't seen any.
The Museum of Fine Arts in Boston has a vertical relief with a row of embracing couples with grapes. Is it possible to know where that is from? Are there geographical stylistic differences of these images?
Yes. Well, yes, they are. I think this particular relief has been actually published by Tadashi Tanabe, who's and also Katsumi Tanabe. This I would tend to relate a stylistic, on the basis of stylistic analysis. I would tend to place it in the Peshawar basin. So related to the school of Peshawar, but where specifically it would be, I wouldn't dare to say. I would remain cautious. But I think, if you have enough some type of archival documentation about the way this relief made its way into how this relief made its way into the collection, and one could potentially sort of reconstruct its pedigree and kind of assign it to one specific archaeological site, or narrow down the range of possibilities.
What are the names of the sutras for the basis of these erotic couples? Do they appear in the Sutra of the Life of the Buddha? Are they result of Greek or Roman art?
Stylistically speaking, formally speaking, they do bear importance. they owe quite a lot to the Greek and Roman repertoire, but not only. And I think they've been, the iconography have been reshaped, revisited, which is, what I mentioned earlier about the influx from different regions and cultures. Sorry, I kind of forgot the second part of the question. The sutras.
The sutras, yeah. Are there any sutras that
that's
mention?
what Katsumi Tanabe has tried to do, to try and really equate these imageries with specific sutras. I think I find it very difficult to equate to map one-to-one a specific sutra with that type of iconography, which I think lends itself or points to so many different connections and so many different implications in terms of literary associations or symbolic and semantic associations. So I would suggest to look into the studies by Katsumi Tanabe to sort of explore the range of sutras that have been capitalized on or evoked to make sense of these scenes. I hope that answers the question to some extent.
Well, I'm looking at the question box, and I think, oh, wait. Apart from the religious significance of the wine drinking tableau, do you think that they were sponsored by local winemakers as advertisements?
Well, I mean, I think they were, as the research by Filigenti and Falk clearly shows, they were clearly sponsored by local lay people. Whether some of them were winemakers, right, possibly, but one can only guess.
Well, I have one more. I was wondering to what extent you think that the contemporaneous texts and art representing drinking and drunkenness as a physical or a psychological phenomenon. Do you get a sense that the vinaya stigmatizes drinking for the obstacles to enlightenment that it entails, or is it more an issue of monastic comportment? Perhaps the answer is not exclusive. And are the artistic representations depicting literally physical effects, or are they speaking about psychological effects by means of a physical metaphor?
That's I would love it if you could copy the question and send it to me. I mean, it's many.
You'll have it, yeah.
Very difficult to answer now, and I think the various possibilities pointed to by the member of the audience are, as I said, non-exclusive. But I'd be interested to engage in a discussion here, rather than try and grapple with that question here and now.
I think. Were these couple? I'll do one more. Were these couple images developed into Mithuna couples?
Well, I think it's the question of the chicken and the egg. I think we have these Mithunas, these Indian couples and on the Indian subcontinent, and these amorous couples embracing and which have a stronger connection to Western iconography. But I think some members of the people who engage with these reliefs, for them, maybe some applies the notion, the concept of Mithuna on these, and for others it was an typically Greek amorous couple. Yeah.
Yeah, I say chicken or the egg a lot in my classes, trying to grapple with sort of the chronology of a lot of the visual representations and analogies.
Yeah.
So
I think these interactions are interactions in the sense that they're not unidirectional.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, I want to thank Jessie for her willingness to come and speak to us, and for a wonderful paper and a wonderful research project that we look forward to hearing a lot more about. I want to thank Osmund for his willingness to be a panelist, and also for his introduction of Jessie. And then lastly, I want to thank the audience for tuning in. I'm sorry we couldn't hear your questions, but I hope that we answered some of them, if not all of them. And actually, lastly, I want to thank Frank B.A. and Sky van Valkenburg for taking care of the logistics. With this lecture, we come to the end of the Gandharan series, sponsored by the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies and the Center for Buddhist Studies. But I'm hoping that all of us get a chance to actually visit the BAMFA, the Berkeley Art Museum, and see these images, these great images in person. So thank you very much.
Thank you also from my side. It was a great pleasure, honor to be there. And if anyone from the audience has a question, they're very welcome to post them to me by email.
Well, take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.